Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior and respected professional and an author from Cape Town, South Africa, Mr. Pierre du Plessis. Pierre, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Ash. Thank you so much for having me. Really looking
Thank you.
forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Pierre is a keynote speaker, a strategist, and a coach. He's the founder of Be Brave, and he's an author of 4 books, as well as the recipient of the Desmond Tutu Jarrett Brand Prize for Literature. So, Pierre, my first question for you, your career spans fashion, advertising, branding, product design, and strategy. How did this diversity shape your own career and your thinking?
Well, I do have a very interesting story, and also part of it that was left out there is theology, which is also a part of the mix. So, the my journey started in design, in fashion
Mm,
design specifically, and throughout my career in all the different fields, what it has done is taught me to think in a very conceptual and broad way.
mm,
To design is really about a conversation with the rest of the world. And
mhm,
so is philosophy, ethics, theology. And then strategy is how we find our way as a business or as an individual within that world. So all those different disciplines have really given me sort of a holistic, very broad view of the world and taught me how to think and how to
mm.
think conceptually and creatively.
Yeah, yeah, well said. What lesson from your early career still guides your decisions today?
Lesson from my early career, sure, that's an interesting one. I think what guides my decisions is whenever I get stuck, what I learned most of all from fashion and from design is when you look for unusual combinations
Hmm.
and things that people won't necessarily put together.
Hmm.
So in design, we would think of, let's say you're inspired by Japanese culture, but doing a collection or design just on Japanese culture is very boring,
Mm.
or could be very boring or very, everyday. And then, but if we combine that with something like Lego, then that becomes a really interesting idea
Mm.
and it becomes
Mm.
something completely new.
Mm.
So even in business strategy today, whenever we find when we're working on a strategy for a business, we find some sort of paradox and some sort of tension
Mhm.
within the business, my gut instinct is to lean into that tension and not try and resolve it. Like,
Mm.
will we be really innovative and
Mhm.
will we always be compliant? It's like, yes, we'll do both. And then
Mm.
what does that look like? So that becomes a really interesting thing when you find those paradoxes and those opposites. They become interesting decisions for me.
Very interesting. You just mentioned strategy, and you speak about strategy through the lens of chaos. Why do so many
Yeah.
leaders still fear chaos instead of working with it?
Oh, because we make a fundamental mistake. We think that life's default setting is easy. Like
Mm.
the game is supposed to be set on easy, but the game is not set on easy. The game is always set on not even difficult. It's set on chaotic mode.
Mm.
So life is chaos. It's always chaotic, and it's always been chaotic.
Mm.
I've been speaking about chaos on stages around the world for about 15 or 20 years. And recently, I've grown so tired of telling people we live in a chaotic world, or we live in a VUCA world, or a
Yeah.
Barney world, or whatever the new acronym is. And right now, I'm sort of screaming from stages, it is chaotic. That is life. Get used to it and get on with it.
Mm.
That's why our assumption, our expectation is that things should be easy, but it's
Mm.
not. Life is difficult and life is suffering. And as my wife always reminds me, she says, we are made to walk uphill. Get used to it.
Mm. Mm. Well said. How should leaders rethink strategy in a world that no longer behaves in predictable cycles? And give me an
Yeah.
example if you can.
So, for example, as per my previous answer as well, the world has never behaved in predictable cycles. Like that's not, I can't remember a time when the world was behaving in predictable cycles. So that's the first mistake.
Hmm.
The second mistake is strategy is about positioning, most of all. It's about key decisions that you make. And then when you are on the field playing, your tactics will change. So your day to day will change, but you remember how you decided you're going to position yourself. So often what people do is they want to lay out a strategy and then they just want to roll it out. But
Mm,
strategy is something that's always in draft mode and should be revisited weekly, monthly, quarterly, all the time. You should be looking at it. How are we going to play? How are we going to win this game? How are we going to reach our goals? And then make key decisions. And that's where leaders often struggle is by having to say no.
mm,
Leaders really have trouble to say no because no means you're saying no to opportunities, you may be saying no to money, you may be saying no to new markets and new things. But at the heart of strategy is decision making, deciding how are you going to show up
mm.
as a person.
Yeah. And tell me, what is the most common strategic mistake you see senior leadership teams make in today's context?
They think strategy equals growth.
Hmm.
So often they'll say, our strategy is to grow 5 times or 20% or 30% or whatever it is, right? So that is the key mistake because growth is not a strategy. Growth is a goal. Saying you're going to grow 5x or 10x, and often young leaders as well would do this. We're going to grow 10x. That's a strategy. And then I would ask, but how? And they say, well, we're going to grow 10x. And I would go, okay, but how are you going to do that? And they go,
Mm,
well, we're going to grow. We're going to sell more stuff. And then the graph is going to go up and to the right. Like that's what's going to happen. And that's the key mistake because strategy is not a goal. Strategy is also not a vision. Strategy is a decision about
mhm.
how you are going to win. So,
Right.
as Jeff Bezos would have said, strategy is whatever makes your beer taste better. So,
Mm,
whatever makes your product better, that's your strategy. It's not growth.
mm. Well said. How do you personally distinguish between strategic patience and strategic procrastination?
How would you, how would I, strategic patience and strategic procrastination? There's a time for refusing to make a decision and intentionally doing so, and there's a time for, there's sometimes when people don't make a decision out of fear.
Mm,
Strategy at its heart, like I said earlier, is about just making decisions. And
mm,
when you are out of fear not making a decision, then you probably are procrastinating. But when you are calm and from a place of wisdom and waiting to see what unfolds, that is patience. So that takes real skill to discern after a while. And there's no hard and fast rule about when to do which one.
mm,
It's time and experience will
mm,
teach you that.
mm.
But not making a decision is also necessary at times to just wait to see how things play out and what actually works. With some decisions that we make in life and in business are decisions that you can't come back from,
Correct.
like they're one-way doors.
Correct.
So especially those decisions, you should be patient. You shouldn't make them very hastily.
Mm. When I used to serve on boards, now I'm much older, but I often said that strategic procrastination is when the board suddenly says, "Can we get some more information?" Which really means we're not ready to take a decision. What do you think?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I mean, sometimes that's valid. Like sometimes you just don't have the data.
Oh.
But often in my case, people have all the data, too much data, and they just need to. A lot of strategy is also about gut. It's
Mm,
also about saying, I know that this is the right thing to do.
mm,
Because people that are especially senior people, they come with decades of experience and they can't always tell you exactly why this is the right decision,
mm,
but they know that they know because they've been working in that industry or they've been alive for that
mm,
long
mm,
and you just need to trust them. So especially if it's your board or your senior leadership team, those people should be on there for a good reason, that you trust their judgment and their experience and
mm.
trust their gut. And when they come to you, even if the data says something else and they say,
Yeah.
well, I really believe that we should be doing X and Y,
Mm,
then you should trust them, right?
yeah.
There's something to be said for that. And I think it's something that's lacking in teams quite
Mm,
often.
amazing. My next question, Pierre, is why do organizations often oversimplify complexity? And what does this cost them?
Well, I mean, I wonder if that statement is always true. I don't know if organizations generally oversimplify complexity. I think they're too scared of
Mhm,
complexity
mhm.
and they just avoid it and they
Right.
assume that it's not that difficult. So maybe in that way they oversimplify it. They oversimplify it because it is complex. And there are
Right.
many unknown unknowns.
Mm.
So, and a complex system behaves, it doesn't behave in any predictable way. So if you pull on this little strand, you don't know what's going to happen with the rest of the system and you'd be surprised. So it's easier to delude yourself to think, well, these things function in silos or they function separately and it will have no impact when I reduce cost on this side or I up expenses on that side or I
Mm.
move our production over here or I change our branding over there. Like
Mm.
it's delusional to think that, but it's just too frightening for people to think that I have to think about all these different effects that my decisions can have. So then they tend to try and oversimplify it rather than dive into the complexity. And people don't like unknown unknowns. They don't like chaos. They don't like uncertainty. But uncertainty is a natural part of our world. And often it's
Mm.
in the uncertain that we find true innovation. Like my son, who's now 16 or 17,
Mhm.
16, like he says, you know, it's always funny to him. He's quite the engineer, and it's always funny to him how, so many inventions are completely accidental.
Mm.
The person who invented the microwave was like, oh, all of a sudden the candy bar melted in my pocket, and now there's this brilliant invention.
Mm.
So many inventions are completely accidental because they form part of complex
Correct.
systems. So if
Correct.
you're not playing with that uncertainty and that randomness, and trying to get everything to predict and assuming everything is really simple,
Mm.
you're going to miss out on a lot of innovation and a lot
Mm.
of good surprises.
Very interesting. Your academic work focused on loneliness and belonging. How does this
Yes.
show up inside organizations today?
Well, it shows up in organizations. It shows up all over the world. Like we are in a loneliness pandemic, which the pandemic revealed or uncovered. So, which many people call like the true pandemic. And loneliness has been on the rise now for the last decade or more across the world and across income groups and races and classes. It's
Yeah.
quite universal and frightening. And in the workspace, there are several factors that contribute to it. So
Hmm.
one of the things, remote work is one of the obvious ones that contribute to loneliness or can contribute to loneliness if the individual isn't taking care of themselves in other areas of their life, and if the organization is not necessarily taking care of their people. And
Hmm.
then also just culturally, if a business has a not a very strong culture, not a very strong trusting culture,
Right.
that can also cause loneliness in the individual, where you really don't trust and respect people to do their jobs. So, and then what loneliness would do is about 70%, 60 to 70% of people will resign from a position if they don't have a friend at work. It's very important for things like retention and churn and retaining talent for people to connect to other people.
Hmm.
People are tribal creatures. So that's one of the things. So remote work is one of the things. The office lunch is disappearing. Like we don't have office lunches anymore. Even in France,
Yeah.
where office lunches were legendary and would last 2 hours and include wine,
Hmm.
are now gone, where people
Yeah.
would just eat at their desks and not eat together. So one of the main things that I would always encourage offices to do is to bring back the office lunch and encourage that
Hmm.
people spend time
Hmm.
and eat together.
Hmm.
And then also gig work, like people just work on short contracts,
Correct.
often remotely for organizations on the other side of the planet. That also plays a role in creating
Correct.
loneliness, and also open plan offices. There
Yeah.
are many different things. So loneliness is also complex. So there's many different things that cause it, and one of the things as well is open plan offices, which is ironic because you think that open plan offices would do the opposite and connect people, but they
Yeah.
don't, because people don't like feeling like they are being observed all the time. So
Correct.
when you walk into an open plan office, you will often see most of the people are wearing headphones and they're trying to drown out the noise and trying to focus, which also drowns out other people. But where people have sort of offices and cubicles that maybe mixed with some sort of open plan,
Hmm.
you'll often see little groups of people gathering inside of offices and talking and chatting together. So
Hmm.
that layout of an office, even though it's claimed to be more productive and claimed to be more collaborative is actually not. And it's
Mm.
been proven sort of over and over again in various studies, and still organizations seem not to take heed because
Mm.
it's cheaper. Like
Correct.
I mean, the hard truth is an open plan office is just cheaper
Mm.
than creating lots of little offices for people.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
but that causes loneliness, and then loneliness will affect your churn, and it will
Mm.
affect productivity. People
Correct.
are less engaged, far more likely to be less engaged, far more likely to obviously be less collaborative. And loneliness is also a sort of a reinforcing system. Lonely people, the lonelier people get, the less they want to collaborate. So
Correct.
the less approachable they become. So they also become more anxious, more irritable because they are lonely. And the more irritable they become, the more other people avoid them, the more lonely they become. So it's this cycle
Yeah.
that reinforces itself.
Great
So it's a
response.
very real problem that organizations need to be clever about. And I'm not one to say that remote work should go and everybody should
Mm.
be in an office. I don't think
Mm.
that's necessarily the answer. I think definitely there are different. I've been part of organizations that are remote first or remote only with a great culture, where people are really dedicated and collaborative and do not feel a sense of loneliness and work
Mm.
all over the world. So
Mm.
it's not just that. That's the easy one to blame.
Absolutely. In fact, as you were talking, I was thinking years ago, it used to be more management by walking around on the floor that you were sitting on, and conversations at the water cooler and conversations in the coffee machine were very
Mm.
valuable to handle loneliness. But great points you made on loneliness. Thank you. How has your own definition of leadership evolved or changed over the past few years?
Yo, that's an interesting one. I often talk about leadership. I do a talk or a session with leadership, normally with excos or sort of high level teams. And I think there's a natural progression for leaders that when they start out, they're very much in what I call the warrior phase. So some
Mm.
sort of the archetypes that I borrowed from Jung and the other heroes and myths, legends and stories. And people are often in the warrior phase where they're
Mm.
going out hard and building, 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 leading hard, driving their people hard, really fighting the fight to build their
Mm.
organizations.
Mm.
And they and either chasing the exit or chasing the revenue or chasing the world global domination or whatever it is.
Mm.
And there comes a time in a leader's life where he or she needs to make a shift towards what I term the monarch stage, also a classic archetype.
Mm.
And the monarch stage is not about fighting and conquering and pioneering, although that's very important. Like, don't get me wrong, that's very important, and we
Mm.
won't have great businesses without that.
Yeah.
But the latest stage of leadership is as vital and is something that I think is missing in many organizations, and where you become the good monarch. So a good monarch is, if you look at the archetype, a good monarch brings peace to the realm. They have what the Chinese would call the mandate of heaven, so to bring order and harmony.
Mm.
And they create structure. So they create structure within where the people can communicate. They create collaboration, like a one language or one currency, for
Mm.
example. And
Mm.
if you think about the role of a leader in that stage, that's what they need to do. It's not about conquering and blowing the lights out all the time. Like, there's other people that can do that. But that leader needs to be focused on creating structure, unifying the people, holding peace, and then last is resourcing. So resourcing the people. So the monarch archetype would resource and sort of open the treasure chests
Mm.
of the monarchy to resource projects and then to bring life. Like monarchs, the archetype is also about, it's generative. It
Mm.
brings life into an organization.
Correct.
It's not something that sucks out life.
Mm.
And then monarchs also, I mean, we can go on and on about it, but in this session, I also talk about monarchs. They don't have an audience, they give audience. So they listen to their people and they listen and give audience to see where they can assist, where they can resource, where they can create structure and they can bring peace. So that's a very different way of leading than being the all-conquering warrior and hero. And it's very difficult.
Mm.
It's very difficult for people to make that transition because that transition requires quite a bit of sacrifice. in not being the guy on the stage, not being the guy on the cover of the magazine,
Mm.
not being the person that's, everywhere all the time, but taking more of a supportive, kingly, queenly role and resourcing, creating structure, creating peace. So it's a
Very
lot less
interesting.
glamorous.
Very
People
interesting.
don't like that.
And you've given me a very interesting definition and evolution of leadership. But therefore, a follow-up question for you that you worked as a trend
Mm.
analyst. Are there any current leadership trends that worry you?
Ooh, leadership trends that worry me. Let me think about that for a second. But it does worry me, this incessant chasing of growth. It's
Mm.
everybody wants to become a unicorn,
Hmm.
and that there's a saying, I can't remember who said it to me once. It's there's only two things in the world that grow for the sake of growing. It's cancer and business.
Mm.
So just growing for the sake of growing is not always the best decision. So businesses should grow. That you should at least grow by inflation, or maybe a little bit more. But just growing for the sake of growing is always worrying for me. And also another thing that's worrying for me sometimes about leadership is an obsession with sort of reverse engineering purpose in an
Mm.
organization.
Mm.
Like people would say there's a trend, but like every organization should have some sort of higher calling and higher purpose, which I think is true and to an extent, but sometimes it's a lot less glamorous than we'd like to think. Like we'd sometimes the purpose of an organization is to provide employment for thousands of families,
Mm.
and that's great. Like
Yeah.
that's not a bad thing at all. But
Mm.
we want it to be bigger than that. Everybody wants to be, you know, Mother Teresa or some, great big beta factory. We spoke about Desmond Tutu before the call as well. Everybody wants to be that. Like the business needs to be that. But sometimes it's just making money so
Yeah.
that people can feed their families, and
Yeah.
that's a great purpose.
Correct.
So, and that worries me because that sort of reverse engineering purpose and sort of forcing it onto an
Mm.
organization can actually cause more harm than
Mm.
good. Because one, you're lying to your people and you're lying to your customers because
Mm.
it's not what you're about.
Very interesting. I have time for two more questions for you. Why do so many successful people still feel disconnected from meaning?
Because they expect meaning to come from the outside.
Mm.
They
Correct.
expect that their success will give them meaning, the money will give them meaning, the exit will give them meaning, the role will give them meaning,
Mm.
or that's not how meaning works.
Yeah.
So meaning, well, the world is chaotic, and then you need to answer it not with control, but with creativity.
Mm.
So we human beings, we have the ability to create meaning, and we
Mm.
keep on expecting life to give us meaning. So
Mm.
Viktor Frankl said, life is the one who asks us questions. We keep on asking it, what is the meaning? But it asks us the same question. So
Correct.
you have to give it meaning.
Well
You have to
said.
define it. You have to figure out what that is. And it's not about not expecting something from outside to give it to you, your bank account or your, whatever it is, or your accolades or so, but you give it meaning. And often it's got to do with the story that you tell yourself.
Correct.
So, and the stories we tell ourselves is what creates meaning, but it's a story we tell ourselves about the change that we're making. So if you meaning comes from seeing a change that I make, we're using my talents and my skills, and in the story I'm telling about what I am a part of. So
Mm.
there's a classic little parable about three men busy working on a cathedral, three stonemasons, and a priest walks past the one day and says to the first stonemason, "What are you busy doing?" And he says, "Can't you see I'm putting one brick on top of another?" And he goes to the second and says, "What are you doing?" And the second stonemason says, "Can't you see I'm busy providing for my family?" And then he goes to the third stonemason and says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Can't you see I'm busy building a house for the divine?"
Mm.
So three different people doing exactly the same job,
Yeah.
and maybe two of them really have meaning. So
Absolutely.
it's about the narrative from the
Correct.
inside. We are meaning making machines.
Mm.
And the way we do it is through story, creating change. And then the story we tell ourselves about that change. That's
Great
where meaning comes
response.
from.
Great response. And my last question for you, Pierre. If you could leave leaders with one question they should ask themselves regularly, what would it be?
Um, it would be a sort of a twofold question. What is life? What is life bringing to me right now?
Hmm.
So what is some life giving to me right now? So what is bringing me joy, excitement, energy, even though it might be
Yeah,
difficult and hard?
yeah.
What is that? What do I sense? Where are those things in my business and in my life? And then the opposite or the twin question to that is where are things bringing death to me, where they feel like they're soul destroying and sucking the life out of me?
Mm,
Where though, which, what is happening in my life? Like taking time to reflect and asking that sort of twofold question,
mm,
and then spending time to then act on that. So, well, I'm going to lean more into the life-giving ones. I'm going to lean away from the soul destroying actions or things, and even as a
yeah,
business as a whole or as an individual. And I think that developing that the ability to discern is very powerful for leaders.
abs-
So that's something I would encourage everybody
abs-
to make a habit out of.
absolutely. And on that note, I just want to say, Pierre, what a fascinating conversation this has been. I just love the incredible amount of wisdom you have on life, on you spoke about chaos, on loneliness, on strategy, and right at the very end when you talked about life, I was reminded of a chapter that I've just written in one of my books that most of us are really governed by four words, which is if only and only if. That seems to be able to define every time we run
Yeah,
into a problem. These two phrases seem to govern our lives. And
yeah,
you've given
that's
us some
very
great
true.
answers to be able to get out of this conundrum that all of us face. Thank you for speaking to me and good luck to you.
Thank you, Ash, so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.